It started like every other late-night interview: laughter, applause, and a host delivering a joke that seemed harmless on the surface. But this time, something didn't land the way it was expected to. The smile didn't fully return. The pause lasted just a second too long. And in that moment, on live television, Pedro Pascal didn't just laugh it off. Before we break down exactly what happened in this unexpected exchange, make sure you subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because moments like this reveal what really happens when unscripted reality breaks through polished entertainment. This wasn't a viral clip engineered for attention. It wasn't a rehearsed bit gone slightly off script. It was a real-time shift, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. The kind of moment that doesn't rely on volume or chaos, but on timing and reaction. At the center of it was Pedro Pascal, an actor who had, in recent years, become one of the most recognizable faces in entertainment. Known for his performances across major television series and films, he had built a reputation not just for his work, but for his presence, thoughtful, charismatic, and often warm in interviews. Audiences connected with him not because he tried to dominate a conversation, but because he seemed comfortable within it. Across from him sat Seth Meyers, the host of Late Night with Seth Meyers. A seasoned comedian with years of experience in live television, Seth Meyers had built his career on timing, delivery, and understanding exactly where the line is and how to play around it. His interviews often blended humor with insight, creating a space where guests could be both relaxed and engaged. And that's what made this moment stand out. Because in an environment designed for laughter, something didn't follow the usual pattern. Late-night shows operate on rhythm. There's a structure: monologue, setup, punchline, response. Guests are expected to lean into that rhythm, to respond in ways that keep the energy moving. Even when jokes are sharp, they're usually met with laughter, deflection, or a quick shift in tone. But every so often, that rhythm breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make people notice. This particular interview came at a time when Pedro Pascal's visibility was at its peak. His performances had brought him widespread recognition, and with that came increased media attention. Interviews became more frequent. Public appearances carried more weight. And like many actors at that level, every word, every reaction, every moment on camera was being watched more closely than ever before. At the same time, late-night television continued to evolve. Audiences weren't just watching for entertainment. They were watching for authenticity, for moments that felt real. And while most interviews remained within familiar boundaries, viewers had become increasingly aware of when something felt unscripted. That awareness matters, because it changes how moments are perceived. A joke that might have passed unnoticed years ago now gets analyzed. A pause becomes meaningful. A reaction becomes a headline. And when a guest chooses not to follow the expected response, it creates a ripple effect. That's exactly what happened here. What makes this moment significant isn't that a joke was told. Jokes are the foundation of late-night television. They are expected. They are part of the format. What matters is how that joke was received. Because in this case, the reaction didn't fully align with the expectation. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't a confrontation in the traditional sense. But it was enough of a shift to change the direction of the conversation. And in live television, even the smallest shift can feel amplified. From the audience's perspective, everything still looked normal at first. The set, the lighting, the familiar exchange between host and guest, it all followed the usual pattern. But underneath that, there was a subtle change in energy. The kind that's hard to describe in the moment, but easy to recognize afterward. Pedro Pascal, known for his relaxed demeanor, appeared just slightly more measured. Not uncomfortable, not defensive, but aware, more focused on the conversation than the performance of it. Seth Meyers, maintaining his usual composure, continued the interview with the same professional rhythm, but with the understanding that something had shifted. And that's where the tension begins to build. Because moments like this don't happen in isolation. They are shaped by context, by everything that comes before them. The public image of the guest, the style of the host, the expectations of the audience. All of it plays a role. And when those elements don't align perfectly, even for a brief moment, the result can be something far more revealing than a typical interview. This wasn't about conflict. It was about control. About who defines the tone of the conversation, and what happens when that tone is quietly challenged. As the interview continued, the surface-level interaction remained intact, but the underlying dynamic had changed. And for viewers watching closely, it became clear that this wasn't going to be just another late-night segment. Because sometimes, it only takes one moment, a single joke, a brief pause, a measured response, to turn a routine interview into something people remember long after it ends. And what happened next would only make sense once you understand everything that led up to it. In the years leading up to that interview, Pedro Pascal had reached a point in his career where visibility and expectation moved together. His performances had earned recognition across different audiences, but just as important was how he presented himself beyond the screen. Interviews, press tours, and public appearances became part of a larger narrative, one that audiences followed just as closely as his roles. What stood out about Pedro Pascal in those settings was consistency. He didn't rely on exaggerated reactions or carefully constructed personas. His tone was usually steady, his humor understated, and his approach to interviews grounded. He engaged, but he didn't overshare. He responded, but he didn't perform beyond what felt natural. Over time, that created a specific expectation. Viewers anticipated a calm, thoughtful presence whenever he appeared. But with increased recognition comes a different kind of attention. As his profile grew, so did the frequency of his appearances on major platforms, including late-night television. And those appearances, while often relaxed on the surface, carry their own set of dynamics. They are structured to entertain, but they also shape how a public figure is perceived. Every interaction contributes to a broader image. At the same time, the environment of late-night talk shows had its own evolution. Shows like Late Night with Seth Meyers are built on timing and tone. The host guides the conversation, blending humor with insight, keeping the pace consistent. Jokes are part of that structure, not just as standalone moments, but as transitions, as bridges between topics, as a way to maintain energy. And within that structure, there's an understanding. Guests are expected to move with the rhythm, to react in ways that support the flow of the segment. Even when a joke is unexpected, the response is usually quick, laughter, a light comment, a smooth continuation. That's what keeps the format intact. Seth Meyers had built his reputation on understanding that rhythm. His background in comedy and live television gave him a strong sense of timing. He knew how to guide a conversation, when to insert humor, and how to keep things balanced. His interviews rarely felt forced, even when they followed a clear structure. But structure doesn't eliminate unpredictability, because humor, at its core, depends on interpretation. What one person finds lighthearted, another might see differently. And when a guest has spent years being analyzed, through interviews, headlines, and public commentary, there's an added layer to how they process those moments. Pedro Pascal had, for the most part, navigated media attention without significant controversy. He wasn't known for pushing back during interviews. He didn't frequently challenge hosts or redirect conversations. His approach was cooperative, but not passive, engaged, but measured. That balance is important, because when someone who typically maintains that level of composure responds differently, even slightly, it becomes noticeable. Leading into this particular interview, there was no widely recognized tension between Pedro Pascal and Seth Meyers. No prior exchange that suggested conflict. On paper, it was a routine appearance, another segment in a long list of late-night interviews. But routine doesn't mean predictable. The structure of these interviews often includes moments where the tone shifts, from general discussion into something more specific. A story, a reference, or a joke that connects to the guest's public image or recent work. These transitions are carefully timed, but they rely on one key element, alignment. The host's delivery, the guest's reaction, and the audience's response all need to connect. And when they don't, even briefly, the shift can be felt. As the interview began, everything followed the expected pattern. The introduction was smooth. The opening exchange carried the usual energy. There was laughter, easy conversation, and a sense of familiarity that comes from experience on both sides. Pedro Pascal appeared relaxed, responding naturally, engaging with the host and the audience in the way viewers had come to expect. Seth Meyers maintained control of the pace, guiding the conversation with his usual precision. But within that flow, the direction of the conversation began to narrow. The topics became more specific, the tone slightly more focused. Not serious, but more deliberate. It was the kind of transition that often leads into a comedic setup, something tied to the guest's public persona, something designed to land as a moment of humor. And that's where the pressure begins to build. Because a setup creates expectation. It signals to the audience that something is coming, a line, a reference, a punchline that will connect the conversation to a reaction. And when that expectation is established, the response becomes part of the moment. But expectation doesn't guarantee outcome. As Seth Meyers moved into that setup, everything appeared aligned. The timing, the delivery, the structure, it all followed the pattern that had worked countless times before. But there was one variable that couldn't be controlled: how it would be received. Pedro Pascal, sitting across from him, remained attentive. His posture steady, his expression neutral but engaged. There was no indication, at that moment, that anything was about to shift. But that's often how these moments unfold. Not with warning. Not with build-up that's obvious to everyone in the room. Just a single point where expectation meets reality. And in that brief space, between the delivery of a joke and the reaction that follows, everything can change. Because once the response doesn't match the rhythm, the interview is no longer following a script. It's unfolding in real time. And that's exactly what was about to happen. The moment arrived without any clear signal. Seth Meyers delivered the line with the same timing and control that defined his style. The setup had been clean, the transition smooth, and the tone consistent with everything that came before it. From the outside, it looked like another routine late-night exchange, a joke designed to keep the conversation light and the audience engaged. For a fraction of a second, it seemed like it would land exactly as expected. There was a ripple of laughter from the audience, but it wasn't immediate, and it wasn't uniform. It came in unevenly, a few voices reacting faster than others, creating a subtle gap in the rhythm. The kind of gap that most viewers wouldn't consciously notice, but could feel. And then the focus shifted. To Pedro Pascal. He didn't react right away. No quick smile. No immediate acknowledgement. No instinctive lean into the humor. Instead, there was a pause, brief, but clearly separate from the natural flow of the segment. His expression remained composed, but it changed. Slightly. His eyes stayed on Seth Meyers, more focused now, less relaxed. His posture adjusted just enough to signal attention, not discomfort, not tension in an obvious sense, but awareness. The kind of awareness that comes when something doesn't align the way it was expected to. The audience, sensing that pause, began to quiet. Not completely silent, but the laughter faded more quickly than usual. The background energy that typically carries these moments forward began to settle. Attention narrowed, shifting from the joke itself to what would come next. Pedro Pascal leaned forward just slightly. And then he responded. His voice was calm, measured, but different. There was a firmness in his tone that hadn't been present earlier in the interview. Not confrontational, not raised, but intentional. The kind of tone that signals a choice has been made, not to deflect, not to move past, but to address. He acknowledged the joke. Directly. Not dismissing it, not turning it into a counter-joke, but engaging with it in a way that shifted its meaning. His words were deliberate, spaced with just enough pause to ensure clarity. Each sentence carried weight, not because of volume, but because of precision. The rhythm of the interview slowed. That's what stood out most. Late-night conversations depend on pace, quick exchanges, overlapping reactions, a continuous flow. But here, that flow changed. The space between words became more noticeable. The transitions less automatic. Across the desk, Seth Meyers listened. Fully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't immediately redirect. He allowed the response to unfold, maintaining eye contact, his expression steady but attentive. It was a subtle shift from the host-driven rhythm to something more balanced, where the guest held the floor and the moment dictated the pace. The audience remained quiet, not out of discomfort, but focus, because what was happening no longer fit into the usual structure of a late-night segment. It wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a real-time exchange, unscripted, unedited, and unfolding without a clear endpoint. Pedro Pascal continued, maintaining that same controlled tone. He didn't escalate. He didn't shift into emotion. Instead, he stayed grounded, addressing the context of the joke in a way that reframed it, not rejecting humor itself, but clarifying how it was being received. That distinction mattered, because it allowed the moment to remain professional, even as it moved outside the expected pattern. When he finished, there was a brief pause, slightly longer than the one before his response. Seth Meyers nodded, a small acknowledgement, but visible. He followed up, his tone still calm, but now more measured. The cadence of his voice adjusted, aligning with the shift that had taken place. It wasn't a retreat, and it wasn't a push forward into more humor. It was a recalibration, a recognition of the moment. The exchange that followed remained controlled. There was no escalation, no attempt to turn the situation into something larger. Both sides maintained composure, navigating the conversation with awareness of what had just happened. But even as the interview continued, the tone had changed in a way that couldn't be reversed. The audience responded cautiously now. Laughter returned, but softer, more selective. Applause came, but with a different energy. The automatic rhythm of reaction had been replaced with something more attentive. Because once a moment like that occurs, it stays with the room. Cameras continued to roll, capturing everything as it happened. No cuts, no edits, no second takes. Every pause, every expression, every shift in tone preserved exactly as it unfolded. And that's what gave the moment its weight. It wasn't amplified through volume or conflict. It was defined by control, by the decision to respond rather than deflect, by the ability to maintain composure while subtly shifting the direction of the conversation. As the segment moved forward, Pedro Pascal leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing just enough to signal that his point had been made. Seth Meyers guided the discussion toward more neutral territory, re-establishing the structure of the interview without ignoring what had occurred. But the energy never fully returned to what it had been at the beginning. It couldn't, because something real had entered the conversation, something unscripted. And once that happens on live television, it becomes the moment people remember, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. A brief exchange, a shift in tone, a response that changed the rhythm of the entire interview. And once it aired, it didn't stay confined to that stage. It carried beyond it, because moments like this rarely end when the segment does. They continue, through discussion, through interpretation, and through the way audiences choose to remember them. For a brief moment after the exchange, the studio felt different. Not dramatically, not in a way that would stop the show, but enough to be noticed. The kind of shift that lingers just beneath the surface. The audience, which had been following the rhythm of the interview from the beginning, didn't immediately return to that same energy. The laughter was softer now, the reactions more measured. It wasn't discomfort in the traditional sense. It was awareness. Across the desk, Seth Meyers held his composure, just as he had throughout the entire exchange. That consistency is part of what defines experienced hosts. No matter how the moment unfolds, the responsibility remains the same, to guide the conversation forward without losing control of it. And that's exactly what he did. He didn't rush past what had happened. He didn't attempt to immediately restore the earlier tone with a louder joke or a forced transition. Instead, he allowed a brief pause, just enough space for the moment to settle, before steering the conversation into safer territory. It was a subtle recalibration, the kind that doesn't call attention to itself, but changes the direction of the segment. Pedro Pascal, sitting across from him, remained steady. There was no visible attempt to revisit the exchange or extend it further. He had made his point, clearly and calmly, and now he returned to the flow of the interview, but on slightly different terms. That difference mattered, because even though the conversation continued, the dynamic had shifted. It was no longer just a host leading and a guest responding within a set rhythm. There was now a sense of balance, an understanding that the interaction could move beyond the expected format if necessary. The segment carried on. Topics changed. Lighter moments returned. The audience responded, gradually easing back into a more familiar pattern. But the energy never fully reset to what it had been at the start. Moments like that don't disappear. They stay present, quietly shaping everything that follows. As the interview came to a close, the applause was strong, but slightly more deliberate. Not just a reaction to the performance, but an acknowledgement of the conversation as a whole. For viewers watching live, it felt complete, but also different from a standard late-night segment. And once the broadcast ended, the moment didn't stay confined to the studio. Clips began to circulate. Viewers replayed the exchange, focusing not on volume or confrontation, but on detail. The pause before the response. The shift in tone. The way the conversation slowed, then adjusted. These were the elements that drew attention, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. Online discussions reflected that same focus. Some viewers pointed out how Pedro Pascal handled the situation, with composure, clarity, and control. Others looked at how Seth Meyers navigated the moment, listening, adjusting, and maintaining the structure of the show without dismissing what had happened. What stood out across those reactions was the absence of extremes. There was no widespread sense of conflict. No clear division of sides. Instead, the moment was viewed as an example of something more nuanced, a live television exchange where both individuals responded in real time, without escalation. And that's what gave it lasting relevance. Because in an era where many interviews feel predictable, where answers are often rehearsed and moments carefully managed, this stood apart. It wasn't planned. It wasn't amplified. It simply unfolded. And in doing so, it revealed something about the nature of live television itself. That even within structured formats, there's always room for unpredictability. That even experienced hosts and well-prepared guests can encounter moments that shift the tone. And that how those moments are handled often matters more than the moment itself. For Pedro Pascal, the impact wasn't immediate in terms of headlines or major shifts in public perception. But it reinforced something that had already been part of his image: the ability to remain composed, to respond thoughtfully, and to maintain control without creating conflict. For Seth Meyers, it highlighted a different strength: the ability to adapt, to recognize when the tone of a conversation has changed and to adjust accordingly, without losing the structure that defines the show. That balance is what allows live television to function, even when it moves outside its expected rhythm. Over time, this moment became less about the specific joke and more about what followed it. The response, the pause, the shift. These are the elements that viewers remember, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were subtle and authentic. And that's why it still matters. Because it shows that not every defining moment in entertainment needs to be amplified to be significant. Sometimes, the quiet exchanges carry more weight. The controlled responses leave a stronger impression. The moments that don't fit the usual pattern become the ones that stand out. It's a reminder that behind every interview, every segment, every carefully structured show, there are real people responding in real time. And occasionally, that reality breaks through. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to subscribe to Prime Talk, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because moments like this aren't just part of entertainment. They are part of a larger conversation about media, perception, and how authenticity reveals itself when no one is expecting it.